gentlemen, good evening. And to those of you who have not been to the Danube Institute before, welcome. To those of you who have, welcome back. My name's David Oldroyd-Bolt. I'm a visiting fellow here. It's my great pleasure to present tonight this discussion on China and its role in the future. And our keynote speaker will be visiting fellow Dr. Eric Hendriks, who was a professor at the University of Peking and who has made China his specialism. So I'm not going to speak anymore because he's the man with all the facts. Eric Hendriks.
Thanks, David, for that introduction. Yeah, so how does China see the future? Before we start, I just want to say that I sometimes get advertised as a China specialist, China expert, which is definite. This is not actually something that exists. Anyone who has studied anything in relation to China or has lived in China knows that there's no such thing as a China expert. That would be like saying calling someone a Western culture expert. It's much too broad. Also, I've been studying Chinese political thought. I'm not pretending to be an expert on Chinese political thought or have a very deep understanding. But the reason that I'm speaking to you tonight on the subject of Chinese political imaginings of the future is, first of all, because it's an extremely important topic that isn't often addressed. Second, as a sociologist trained in European social theory, I think I have something to offer through a comparative perspective, and I think that it's fruitful to be confronted with intellectual and philosophical assumptions from different traditions to destabilize your own assumptions within your own traditions. So it's a source of intellectual creativity and critical thought to confront other modes of thought with fundamentally different presumptions. So that's what I will hope to do tonight. We'll dig into the question of how does China see the future. Now, of course, China is a country. It has many people in it. Who in China sees the future in which way? There are various levels to this. But the first thing that's important to realize is that there is such a thing in China as the official view of the future, because there's an official party line determined by Xi Jinping thought. In Xi Jinping thought, we're working from the century of humiliation through a moderately prosperous society to the great rejuvenation of the people, the Chinese people, and a harmonious world in which all the civilizations respect each other. Now, we'll get to that. Xi Jinping thought roots in Marxist-Leninist and classical Chinese intellectual traditions and stands in a broader intellectual field. But despite the fact that it comes out of this field, there's also some tension with it, because Xi Jinping thought being the party line, being the party doctrine, also limits. So it comes from from a broader Chinese intellectual field, but then it acts back on that field as a limiting force. And finally, of course, we'll have a broader expectations in society. The fact that you have certain intellectuals and the official political doctrine having a sense of the future doesn't mean that this is automatically shared by everyone in Chinese society. China is a complex society. People have different opinions. People have different feelings. It's also very hard to do reliable polling in China. And even if you would have somehow magically you would have a reliable poll on the Chinese people's expectations of the future, their confidence in the party to provide good leadership in the 21st century, it probably would give you it would give you this kind of raw Pew poll kind of data, like what percentage likes the future, and it doesn't really give you anything in depth. So I'm more of a fan of ethnographic accounts, but China is currently undergoing a change. It seems that there's been a changing mood in China, where people have been becoming in recent years more pessimistic about the future, and I don't have data to back that up. And I think that in the future we'll have to look at ethnographic data, qualitative research methods, to see where this trend goes. But I just bring up these broader expectations to society to remind you of the fact that we cannot jump from the official political discourse or even this broader intellectual field and these broader intellectual traditions to make assumptions about the society at large. Now, my argument is going to be that on the political level, certainly on the level of the political official doctrine, but also in the broader intellectual sphere, the broader China's political thought and China's political traditions of Chinese political thought, there's a much stronger sense of millenarianism, of utopianism than in the West. So that's a very broad statement, and of course, China has all kinds of intellectual traditions, and the West has all kinds of intellectual traditions, and there have been religious movements in the West that were strongly millenarian. So it's very complex, but overall, I think this holds true that there is a very strong sense of utopianism in Chinese political thought. There is a sense that the near future is going to bring something that's fundamentally better, more just, more moral, more prosperous, more flourishing than what we have now. So, first, in the official political party line, the official account of history promulgated by the Chinese Communist Party, that's now, and the official view is now dominated and set by what's called Xi Jinping thought, which has also been written into the preamble of the Chinese Constitution. In this official account, we move from the century of humiliation in the 19th century to a moderately prosperous society towards a better world in which the Chinese nation is reborn. Now, the century of humiliation was the period in which China was, as the phrase has it, semi-colonized. Important ports, harbors, economically viable parts of China were under the rule of Western powers and eventually also under Japanese rule. The dating on this, 1848 to 1949, is of course a bit of a contested issue. The 1848 is the starting year of the first Opium War. So when Britain invaded China, fought a war with the Qing dynasty, and won that war. All the way up to 1949, which is the declaration of the People's Republic. Now, of course, this is the official People's Republic account of the century of humiliation, because the phrase century of humiliation actually goes back to a Republican era, to the Kuomintang times, and the fact that the end date of the century of humiliation is the founding of the People's Republic is, of course, People's Republic propaganda. So we get that, right? Mao declared the People's Republic in Beijing in 1949. Now, in 1979, Deng Xiaoping said that the goal of China should be not just to overcome the century of humiliation, right? That supposedly the Chinese Communist Party immediately took care of that. But now we are moving towards a moderately prosperous society. And this, according to Xi Jinping thought, this moderately successful, moderately prosperous society, xiaokang, has been accomplished in 2021, exactly 1 century after the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 under the guidance of the Soviet Union and with Soviet funding. And interestingly enough, there was under the directorship of a Dutchman, Dutch communist named Henk Sneevliet, so a compatriot of mine. And there were 12 representatives of local Chinese Marxist-Leninist groups present. One of those 12 people was Mao Zedong. Now, I do think it's interesting there was one Dutch person, because there's also exactly one Dutch person at the Danube Institute. So I like to think that the Dutch, even though we're few in number, we're well dispersed. There's always, if you pay attention to this, there's always, if you go somewhere, there's always one Dutch person, mysteriously enough. And so this one Dutch person and these 12 Chinese communists together found the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, which is currently the most powerful political organization on earth. And under the leadership of this party, now the next step is supposed to be the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So we have just in 2021, we have officially accomplished a moderately prosperous society, and now we're moving towards the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, according to the official historiography of Xi Jinping of thought. Now, before I should mention this, of course, it's going to be accomplished in 2050. Now, on the flyer, it said 2049, because when the great rejuvenation of the party, of the Chinese nation and the healing of the world was first announced by Xi Jinping, and this phrase was actually developed by and first worked out by Wang Huning, the leading intellectual of the Politburo. When it was first put at 2049, because it's 50 years from the accomplishment of the moderately prosperous society. However, 2049 is an awkward year, so Xi Jinping more recently changed that to 2050. So in 2050, we're going to be in this utopia. Now, what is this moderate prosperous society, xiaokang? It's a classical reference, first of all. Now, it's the first reference to xiaokang, moderately prosperous society, was in the classic of poetry, which was completed 7th century before Christ. And but the modern usage of this term more directly refers to Kang Youwei's interpretation of the Book of Rights. The Book of Rights. You will find Confucius in the opening 2 paragraphs of the Li Yun, which is the 7th chapter, refer to his own society as a xiaokang society, because the true datong, the harmony of the old 3 dynasties, the great way, the great unity, the great datong literally means unity, the great harmony had been lost in Confucius' time, according to this Confucian classic. Now we're just in an intermediary phase. So in the original, when it was datong ruled, people didn't just, according to the story, people didn't just love their parents and didn't just love their children, but they loved everyone as if they were their parents or their children. And people had no selfish inclinations, and there were no criminals, and people didn't try to trick each other. And instead of competing against each other, people respected, valued virtue. And men of virtue were selected to be leaders in society, and they led society without having any selfish inclinations. However, in this, according to the Confucius classics, in the time of Confucius, the datong had been lost, and we're now at a xiaokang world in which people usually love their parents, usually love their children, but they do not extend this love to everyone in society. And some people can be trusted, like the Duke of Zhou, who's an exemplary leader, but he is distinguished, Confucius says, exactly because other men are not as good as he was. So now we have a world in which cities need to build walls, and people compete against each other, and there needs to be rules of engagement to manage conflict. But this is a not ideal situation. You should have been in the datong, but regretfully, we're now in the xiaokang. Now, this was taken up this is a bit of a heterodox text, actually, in the Confucian tradition. So these 2 paragraphs that I'm referring to in this account has actually had a bit of a heterodox status in 2,000 years of Confucius history, over 2,000 years of Confucian history. But it was rediscovered, unearthed, and promoted around 1900 by figures such as Kang Youwei. And they started saying that China is in a for instance, in Datong Shu, which was published around 1900, the argument was China is in a state of turmoil, and it should climb up to the xiaokang level. And once it's at the xiaokang level, the moderate process, then it should go to the datong level. And every society in the world, every nation should go through this process. And at some point, the whole world will be in harmony, and the golden age will return in the future. So there's this term, xiaokang, has very, very strong is very philosophically and moralistically loaded. So it's tied up with these utopian visions that are ancient but were rediscovered around 1900. However, the way the Chinese Communist Party uses this concept is much more, bleakly in a more sober way. They refer to GDP statistics. So Deng Xiaoping in 1979 first reintroduced xiaokang notion into the communist vocabulary, and he said China should for the next decades work on building a moderately prosperous society, and is moderate and that should be the aim. So he was very modest there was a sense of modesty to it. However, there was lingering in his account was still this notion of maybe there can be a great utopia in the future. But Deng Xiaoping also said, no, we have to aim low first. In 1990, we're going to have GDP per capita in dollar terms of 500 per person. In 2000, the year 2000, it should be $800 to $1,000. And then in 2050, it can rise to the astronomical number of $4,000 per person annually. Of course, China is now much richer. It stands at, depending on your measurement methodology, it stands around 12. I think, it's over $12,000 per person now, nominally. So Hu Jintao, seeing that Chinese economy was actually growing much faster than Deng had predicted and could foresee, upgraded this notion of xiaokang. Now, in order to be a moderately prosperous society, the GDP numbers had to be much higher. And Xi Jinping took on this notion and said that China needed to double the 2010 GDP statistic in 2021. And then it would have accomplished the moderately prosperous society. Plus, everyone, even in the poor parts of the country, should be above the absolute poverty line, set at 4,000 renminbi annually per person. And this is under the rubric of bringing common prosperity. So Xi Jinping launched a large, so he returned to a more socialist program where he had in fact very effective fight against absolute poverty on the countryside. It doesn't mean that the wealth inequality, income inequality has diminished substantially in China, but it does mean that that's not the case. And actually, Xi Jinping is not pursuing class warfare. However, the absolute poverty rates have been taken out almost entirely. So now in 2021, we supposedly have accomplished this moderate prosperous society based on GDP statistics. However, still in the term itself, in the notion, in the concept, is still this lingering presence of a utopian vision. That is not just about economic growth, but with the economic growth comes a spiritual growth, so to speak. And this is also because, of course, the next step after reaching the moderately prosperous society is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This will revolve around, according to the official party line of Xi Jinping thought, China building genuine cultural self-confidence, China becoming a true unity under the leadership of the Chinese party, and the Chinese party in turn standing fully under the control of the central leadership, which in turn stands under the full control of what is called the core, namely Xi Jinping himself. Sustainable developments, China rising to the level of a great power, and China's territorial integrity. Now, this is also implicitly, of course, a reference to Taiwan, because Taiwan, as a supposed breakaway province, is seen as the last remnant of the century of humiliation when China was colonized by Western powers, partly colonized by Western powers in Japan. So in the 90s, Hong Kong and Macau were returned as the last Western colonies, but Taiwan is still seen as a leftover of the century of humiliation. So only with Taiwan being only once Taiwan has been brought under the direct leadership of the Chinese Communist Party will China be fully united. And only if China is fully united can it truly be great and unified and develop this sense of cultural self-confidence. And then tied to this is also the fate of humanity and the world as a whole. Because while China is rejuvenating as a nation, the world as a whole, humanity as a whole, is going to fulfill its common destiny. So the phrase is the common destiny of humankind. Now, here the notion is that international relations will be, quote, democratized, meaning that all countries will recognize each other as equal, and all political systems will recognize each other as equally legitimate. Hence, there shouldn't be human rights criticism, especially not Western human rights criticisms of things happening in China, because everyone should respect each other's sovereignty by not criticizing internal affairs. Then, and eventually, all the civilizations will live in harmony, all the political systems will live in harmony, and there will be peace and harmony throughout the world. And the principle of competition will be replaced by a principle of harmonious coexistence. Now, how does this work? So you have the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and it's somehow linked to the common destiny of humankind, right? That's supposed to take place on the global level. Well, the trick here is that China, this is a statement by Xi Jinping, China's development is itself the greatest contribution to the world, end of quote. So the most important part of the common destiny of humankind unfolding and actualizing is China actually rejuvenating itself, establishing its territorial integrity. Hence, Taiwan should be under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. China should have this territorial integrity. Taiwan should be part of the People's Republic. The complete Chinese society should stand under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. The Communist Party should completely stand under the leadership of the central leadership, and the central leadership should revolve around the core, Xi Jinping. And if this happens, this will be the cornerstone of a harmonious world unfolding internationally. Now, there is a sense of the end times approaching. The phrase here is profound changes unseen in a century. That's what we're currently in. That's the phrase. Profound changes unseen in a century. This refers back to the century of humiliation that ended with the founding of with the Chinese Communist Party founding the People's Republic of China, and then the next century was, of course, building the moderately prosperous society. So the notion is now we have something that's unfolding that has been unseen in a century. Namely, we're at a great transition point, at an axis in world history, when the Western hegemony will be replaced by a harmonious world inspired by, let's say, traditional Chinese wisdom. And in which China will be one of the countries that will equally respect all other countries, but maybe China is a little bit of a special country. Maybe it's the country, as in the phrase of Xu Jiling. He's a philosopher in Chinese academia who says that China brings the world spirit to the world. Right? Now. There's a little bit of an ominous touch to this profound changes unseen in a century and the common destiny of humankind, because the phrase common destiny for humankind actually derives from a statement by Hu Jintao, the previous paramount leader, in 2007, where he referred to Taiwan and China forming an entity of common destiny linked by blood. So it's really the Taiwan becoming part of China and being under the Chinese Communist Party rule that will make China whole. And it's from this wholeness of a China that's rejuvenated and under the complete leadership of the Chinese Party, which in turn is under the complete leadership of Xi Jinping, it's from this foundation, it's on this cornerstone that this harmonious world will arise. So the Taiwan is crucial, because when Taiwan is taken by China, China can rejuvenate, and the century of humiliation will really, really be completely erased. Right? And this is needed because it will make sure that the world principle of Western hegemony will be replaced by a harmonious world. So it's also certain Chinese intellectuals, such as Zhang Shigong, they call it the Roman spirit. They say the essence of Western civilization is domination, And that's why we have a world, because of Western domination, we have a world where people compete. But if Chinese culture would be leading, he says, then we could install a radically different program in the world order. And this is also tied up with the notion that's very broadly promulgated in Chinese propaganda. And I heard it here in Hungary as well at a Confucius Institute, that China has never invaded another country. China is not really capable of aggressive warfare. It can intervene, but it always interferes on the side of justice and harmony, because its very cultural essence is harmony, right? And if it does something that's perhaps not harmonious, then it's because of Western influence. I recently read a book that is published by Princeton University Press. The title is Chinese Cosmopolitanism. It's written by a scholar, young female scholar of Peking University. And in this book, she has a small little paragraph, because the whole book is about how China has a harmonious spirit that will unleash the true harmony that's in the world. But then she has a little paragraph on Xinjiang, on the Muslims in Xinjiang perhaps not being nicely treated. And then she says, well, this is clearly a case where through Soviet influences on China, and ultimately Western influences, China was straying from its inner sense of harmony. And she says, in fact, China was so innocent when it comes to these matters that it couldn't guard itself against the Roman spirit of hegemony coming from the West, and therefore it was polluted by this sense and did the things that it did in Xinjiang in recent years. But it's ultimately Xinjiang is the fault of the Western spirit, because if the Chinese spirit would be undiluted, then this would not everyone would love each other there, and there would be complete ethnic harmony. It's only because it's because the Chinese are so innocent in their spirit of harmony that they could even be polluted by this. You can just see how evil the Western Roman spirit is in making the Chinese do bad things that they would have never could not have done without Western influence. So. So this is the official political discourse, and it roots in broader intellectual traditions. But as I mentioned, the intellectual field from which it comes is also in turn limited and impacted by Xi Jinping thought. Right? So the space of free intellectual expression and intellectual diversity has been narrowing in China in recent years. But there's definitely a strong sense of utopianism in mainstream Chinese intellectual traditions. And Thomas Metzger, a comparative philosopher and sinologist who is now, I think, almost 100 years old, so he's retired, but he used to write for the work for the Hoover Institute in Stanford, and he calls this Chinese utopianism. Quote, the belief that the concrete here and now not only should, but also could be made morally perfect. So this is an important assumption that's prevalent in Chinese political thought, and actually Thomas Metzger did research mainly in Taiwan in the 70s and 80s, so it's really much broader than the People's Republic or anything recent. There's a very strong tradition of millenarian utopianism in the Chinese philosophical tradition. The notion is that selfishness itself could be removed from people's hearts, and politics could be transformed into friendship instead of a competition. Instead of being a competition in which different players have make strategic moves. Now, it's important to realize that this is a tradition, yes, but it's not really an ancient tradition that's 2,500 years old, so to speak, and for 2,500 years, this assumption ruled China. That's not the case. In fact, it is, as I mentioned, a reference to. It really is strongly associated with the Book of Rights, especially the Liyun chapter, and these two paragraphs were considered very heterodox throughout most of Confucian history, and it was really Kang Youwei with Da Tongshu and his other writings around 1900 that brought this back into the mainstream. So a new kind of utopian Confucianism emerged in around 1900, which was in fact an attempt to merge modernization theory from the West and the Confucian tradition by reformist intellectuals in the late Qing dynasty in the Republican era, and it's on this hybrid modern utopian Confucianism. This is where this sense of utopianism comes from. So, then I will rush a little bit. And so this is Kang Youwei, and it's important to realize that this that his sense of this notion of he had the idea that every nation will move from turmoil to xiaokang, this intermediary stage, moderately prosperous society, to datong, great unity, great harmony, and it was on the foundation. It was on this modernized hybrid utopian Confucianism. This formed the basis of the reception of Marxism-Leninism in China. So it's important to realize that for both Mao Zedong and Sun Zhongshan, the founder of modern China, they used the term datong to describe the communist future. So communism in China and socialism in China has always been mixed up with this modern utopian Confucianism. Now it's important to understand that this is a real influence. So I never took this sense of it being possible for people to be fundamentally improved morally through education and self-cultivation, and hence it being possible to lift society to a fundamentally higher moral level in which leaders can be trusted and selfish impulses can be removed from people's hearts on a massive scale, and politics can be transformed into something that would be unrecognizable for people today, used to politics as being a game of competition and strategy. I never took this really seriously until I had a student of mine in Beijing who was 17 years old, and he told me, "Teacher, I don't understand why people have discussions." I said, "What do you mean you don't understand why people have discussions?" He said, Well, it's a waste of time, right? A waste of energy, because in a few years from now, everyone is going to agree with each other on every important subject. I said, "Well, what do you mean everyone is going to agree with each other on every important subject?" So, and then he said, "Well, because we're going to live in truth. The truth is going to shine forth, and different perspectives will fall away. And this is going to happen in a few years from now." And so I really quizzed him, and I sat him down for actually a few times for a few hours. And it was really, "What do you mean exactly?" And I went through it. And this is when I saw the political philosophy and these political philosophical assumptions reflected in an intelligent 17-year-old being. Then I realized that this is actually an influential intellectual force. So for instance, right now in Chinese academia, you have the new Chensha school, led by figures such as Zhao Tingyang and Xu Jilin, and they argue that in a few years from now, we're going to have a Chensha world in which there will be a moral revolution and selfishness will be removed from people's hearts, and there will not be competition, and all civilizations and political systems and cultures will respect each other. So Zhao Tingyang says, politics must be transformed from an art for transforming enmity into friendship. Politics must be an art for transforming enmity into friendship rather than a technology for coping with competitive conflict. So Xi Jinping has, at various points, and I have some brilliant quotes here, alluded to the fact that he shares this Chensha worldview, this Chensha moralistic utopianism. However, there has also been a narrowing under the leadership of Xi Jinping thought. So a few years ago, you had all these Chensha theorists and all these different forms of new Confucianism in Chinese academic life, in Chinese intellectual life. And I've been seeing a narrowing because Xi Jinping thought has become more and more dominant, and it's become more and more explicated. So a few years ago, there were still competitions between different scholars with rival interpretations of Xi Jinping thought. And in this, by interpreting Xi Jinping thought, they could put their own ideas into Xi Jinping, so to speak. And this was a safe way of having a real intellectual diversity, because everyone is on the good side, because everyone is just trying to figure out what Xi Jinping really meant. And then some scholars say, well, Xi Jinping really wants a world in which, and then someone else says, well, I think it's more like this. But this has been narrowing, this space has been narrowing because Xi Jinping thought has also become more explicated. So I have some, so now we really see that it's really the heart, so not the dreamy new Confucian vision of Qianxia as dominant, but what you truly see now is a much more chauvinistic and sinocentric utopianism on the scene. So it's represented by Zhang Xiaokang, for example, who says that he's a law professor at Peking University. The difference between Chinese and Western culture is that while Western culture consistently attempts to arrive at the resolution of any antagonism in favor of one of the original positions, so Western culture always wants to be right, win the arguments, push the other perspective out of the way. Chinese culture consistently seeks to find a unity within the antagonism which results in a pluralism based on ideas of harmony. The essence of Chinese civilization is a sense of harmony. And therefore, also Zhang Xiaokang in a different essay, the Taiwan issue involves a contrast between two civilizational forces in Asia, the outcome of which will affect the future of human civilization. Because what's at stake it's the battle between hegemony itself and this Chinese sense of harmony, which can unleash harmony on the world stage. Now, I will skip over a few bits here, but I just want to tell you about the broader expectations in society, that these can, of course, diverge very far, both from the official party line and from the fancies of intellectual publications. Now, there's a phrase, 越来越好, which means things are getting better and better. There is a strong sense of optimism in Chinese life, or at least until recently there was such a strong sense of optimism. As an outsider, you notice immediately there's a great sense of energy in Chinese society. But of course, there was also great growth for decades, which is now becoming more stagnant. Also, many Chinese people have been disappointed in the fact that at the end of the COVID pandemic, it turned out that the Chinese Communist Party did not have an end game. So it had caused 1 billion Chinese people to suffer tremendously under lockdowns, and in the end there was no end game, and COVID was let in, and this disappointed a lot of Chinese people. And so I'm getting this sense from what I'm hearing that that the mood in China's society has shifted. But I don't have data on it. I don't think there is reliable data on it, and I think it will take a few years for good qualitative studies to on this to see where the trend is going, whether this 越来越好, this sense of optimism in a broader Chinese society is truly disrupted. So let me just end by saying this all contrasts with what I would call Western presentism. In the West, the utopian visions are really much less pronounced, much more marginal. And this point has been made here, interestingly, at the Danube Institute by various speakers. So we had Frank Furedi argue this at a Danube conference. He says the West is now in strong sense of presentism, an eternal end of history is the dominant imagining. Zoltan Balázs, professor at Confucian University, who we had on the Danube podcast, Buddha Hills podcast, which I'm co-hosting with David Dusenbury. He made that argument, and Christopher Rufo has also made this argument here at the Danube Institute. So the notion is that in the dominant Western political imagination, there is the sense of it is also in the American Constitution, we the people, the fundamental rights of the people have been discovered. The good regime is here, it's liberal democracy, and now we just have to make sure that liberal democracy defends itself against the forces of authoritarianism. So this is a very strong powerful political imagining. And there's also in the French Revolution, there was the sense of a break of history. And interestingly, of course, you have the notion of an ever closer union. David Dusenbury recently brought that up on the Buddha Hills podcast as well, that also in the EU, there is this strong narrative of an ever closer union. So there is a presence that will further intensify, but instead of a radical break and then a fundamentally better future arising. Even activist groups such as Black Lives Matter, according to Christopher Rufo's interpretation at least, do not actually have a utopian vision of a non-racist world, but imagine the fight against racism as an eternal fight, the eternal fight against our unconscious biases. So we're really in a kind of eternal present, an eternal end of history. That's the dominant sense that you're getting in Western political discourse, Western political imaginings of the future. And in China, at least on the level of the official intellectual publications and the official party line under Xi Jinping thought, there's a much stronger sense of millenarianism, of utopianism, of the future bringing something fundamentally different and better. So, although not everyone may be fully relieved by this Chinese vision. So here, so that's, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hendriks. I'd now like to invite David Dusenbury, Senior Fellow at the Danube Institute, to respond.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Eric, for this really fascinating and illuminating talk. I should begin by saying that even though Eric has denied that he's a China specialist, I'm not even really anything but a distant and a dilettantish observer. So I've learned a lot from Eric about China, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. He has the language and so on and so forth. But I do have a keen interest in China's intellectual and cultural history, its political imaginary, its future. I think its history, its political imaginary, and its future are going to shape ours, and they're already doing so. So in reply to Eric's really fascinating talk, from which I've learned a lot, I would just like to raise 4 questions, which are kind of intersecting with his points, and my questions are simply an attempt to hear more from him about kind of perhaps slightly different aspects of, as he began by saying, a massive culture and a massive reality, a massively complex reality. So Eric was stressing the tradition of Chinese utopianism, and I would like to ask a bit about Chinese realism instead. Connected to that, I'm curious to hear from him about the scale of both memory and expectations. So we heard about a century of humiliation, a century of what we might call revolution and recalibration, resulting in the moderately prosperous society. But I'm a little curious whether when we talk about a century and when the Chinese talk about a century, they mean the same thing. I'm also going to ask a very quick question about the realities of Chinese and Asian growth. As we saw at the end, there has been some slump in the Chinese GDP, but I'm going to ask a kind of broader question about that. And finally, just if I have time, a very brief question about the place of the nation in this vision. We heard about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Okay, so to raise all 4 points, but really point 1 and 2, I want to tell a very interesting, what I take to be a very interesting and very brief story. A friend of mine, who is an eminent scholar of the Italian Renaissance, this is important, went to China about 12 or 15 years ago as part of a delegation of the Italian nation. And as such, he was introduced to quite a high-ranking Chinese official. And towards the end of their meeting, the Chinese official said, I want to ask you a question. How many nations in the Americas speak Italian? And of course, the answer is none. And he went on to explain that although the Americas were discovered by an Italian, namely Christopher Columbus, this Italian explorer arrived in the Americas on Spanish ships. And this senior government official said, "We want our own ships." This was a conversation about technological advancement, the technological future. And my friend, this great scholar of the Italian Renaissance, was really struck not only by the fact that this government official, who was not a scholar of the Italian Renaissance, was able to tell him something about his own period, which he had never really thought of, but was able to make a very subtle and powerful point without alienating his interlocutors. It's a very subtly made sort of way of saying that the Chinese do not ultimately want to be reliant on Western technology, which was the context of the conversation. So I suppose I want to ask whether the Chinese are not perhaps engaging in a kind of realistic analysis, which for one reason or another, the West has kind of self-consciously and programmatically abandoned in the post-Cold War era, which we can all agree seems to be coming to an end. And connected to that, I want to ask whether it isn't relevant that the Chinese are both a great and an ancient nation. This thought just occurred to me today. It might not be so important, but it does occur to me that not all nations are great, or rather not all ancient nations are great, and not all great nations are ancient. But when a nation is both, it seems to me that both of these factors must be taken into consideration. This might perhaps be one of the excruciating lessons that the collective West might be learning, or at least being invited to learn about Russia as a result of the, of course, lamentable and quite destructive invasion in 2022. Okay, how does this connect to my broader point? To Americans, I'm an American, a century of humiliation probably sounds very different than it does to at least some of the Chinese. What, after all, is a century to a 3,000-year-old great power plus high civilization such as that of China? Very well. I'm keen to hear much more about Chinese realism and the analytic significance, the possible analytic significance of antiquity when we think about China. I'd like to hear a bit more about the reality and meaning of Chinese growth. It seems to me that perhaps the slide we were shown, which is extremely important, and I'm sure the data is absolutely correct, but nevertheless, it might make us somewhat complacent simply because it is only concerned with kind of growth within China. So I believe, according to the IMF, BRICS, China plus a number of other nations, now accounts for more than 30% of global GDP when you adjust for purchasing power parity. This is up from just 17% in 1995, and this outstrips the G7, which stood last year at 29.9%. According to the Financial Times, in 2024, the economies of China, India, and Russia will all see higher growth this year than will the US, Japan, Germany, or the UK. So it seems that even if there is genuine cause for some unrest and disappointment within China regarding these national GDP numbers, that we should also have significant cause for unrest ourselves. And finally, I would just like to hear very briefly about the Chinese hope for the future as a national hope. So it does seem to me that the West, the collective West, and I think this is something that all of us would take issue with, but the collective West at the end of the Cold War more or less sort of renounced national thought, national interest. We could discuss this. These are complex questions. But there has been some sort of renunciation of the heritage of the nation state by the Western political class. And I'm curious whether we do not see in Asia, actually, a kind of resurgent nationalism within the kind of Tianxia imaginary, this hope for harmony among the nations, but nevertheless not the disappearance of nations. This seems to me perhaps a really interesting point where the collective West in our imaginary peace is connected to the gradual elimination of nations, and this does not seem to be the imagining, from what I can tell from a great distance, in Asia. And that perhaps brings us back to Christopher Columbus and the fact that this senior government official was very interested in the nations involved. We have Spanish ships and an Italian explorer. And because of this national difference, the legacies of the two nations went in very different ways.
Dr. Dusenbury, thank you. Well, shall we work backwards?
Yeah. Well, it's my microphone working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave, for those points. Let me begin by saying, of course, there's a sense of realism in placing yourself in such a long history, because realistically, societal progress, political development, economic development takes a long time. Wars can take a lot. Many things that are important in human history take a long time. So placing yourself in a long stretches of history, as the Chinese political imagination, and then there's Xi Jinping, for better or worse, that this has only been accentuated because he keeps stressing this notion that China stands in this 5,000-year-long civilizational tradition. Of course, there's a lot of kitsch there as well, how that history is portrayed. But still, the sense of history, these stretches of history are very long. Now, there's a utopianism in that image. But there is also, because there's a fundamentally better future on the horizon, perhaps linked up with a golden age that is the past, or inspired by, or being forming somehow a new version of a golden time in the distant past. But still, there's also realism in putting yourself in a longer stretch of time, and it's perhaps also very realistic to think that the present will continue forever. That said, there are certain things in the present constellation that both the dominant Western political imagination and the dominant official party line, China, carry from the present into an eternal future. Right? So in America, the notion is that every 4 years we will have presidential elections, and this should continue into eternity. So 10,000 years from now, if things are going well, we still have American elections every 4 years. If you think through the implications, which of course leads to an absurdity, because I think we all know that in 10,000 years from now we're not going to have an American election, right? That's probably a statement, right? But also, of course, the party in China is supposed to convene forever. It's going to have regular council meetings, and the China in 10,000 years from now should also stand under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, according to official, by implication, according to official the political party line, the protester. So these are things that are existing in the present that somehow get projected into an eternal future. Now, about the status of the nation, nationalism is very interesting, of course, in China's context, and arguably the nationalist angle has been strengthened greatly in recent years. And Xi Jinping has really transformed what's still called Marxism into a kind of Chinese nationalism. Right? So with Marxism, Xi Jinping mainly means the Leninist party state should not mean cosmist. And then, okay, Chinese Communist Party state should rule. What should it rule? The Chinese nation. For what purpose? For the rejuvenation of the nation. So this is a completely transformed Marxism that gets turned into a nationalism. But the nationhood is a very curious object, is a very curious category in light of Chinese history, because China didn't see itself as a nation until fairly recently. That was until the early 20th century, late 19th century. Before the late 19th century, there was no sense of China being a nation in China. So China was Qingbo, the central kingdom, Zhongfa, the central area of the world, the part of the world that grounds legitimacy in the. It's not a nation in the world, and hence all other what we call nations in the world at the time, from the Chinese point of view, were not nations, or they didn't have national sovereignty. They were only legitimate. The national, insofar as they made a claim to national sovereignty, was still legitimate. They were only legitimate insofar as they were symbolically connected with the Chinese center. And the Chinese center was also not a nation. It was not a nation state. It was the center of humanity and universe. So you had a center and you had peripherals, but you didn't have nations that had independent legitimacy whatsoever. The nation-state perspective was brought to China from the West, and really it was through a period of strife that the Chinese felt forced to adopt it. It felt that it was something that invaded them, quite literally, and it had to adjust to. So now we're in a very interesting situation where China is probably more nationalistic, or more explicitly and more openly nationalistic than Western nations at this point are, more confident about nationalism. At the same time, there's the Shensha, the concept itself comes from a time where there were no nations in China's nationality. And now the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is the thing that's going to bring this Shensha into being. And of course, Xi Jinping only rarely uses the concept, the term Shensha, but it's widely used in the Chinese academic landscape. The term itself doesn't really matter. It's this conception that all the different nations and civilizations are going to live in harmony. Also, the idea that all the civilizations have to live in harmony is a romantic born. Because in the past, there was only one civilization. It couldn't be a plurality of civilizations. So we have a fundamentally modern idea, right, that is nationalistic, potentially imperialistic if pushed in certain directions, and makes reference to these classical Chinese conceptions, but still also informed by a really Chinese utopianism that's very traditional, but it has a tradition that goes to around 1900 and makes reference to all the things in the Chinese canon. I mentioned the Book of Rights, the first two paragraphs of the Yun, that actually were mainly considered heterodox in most of Confucian history, because in most of Confucian history there was a golden age that could never be fully restored, and there wasn't a golden future as such. So there wasn't a utopia on the horizon in the future. So then it was much more akin to the Christian fall narrative. So we are really in the we're really in a very curious long history right now.
I'd like to address a paradox that you raised in your last slide about ever closer union in the state, because it seems to me that what we're seeing is, well, the first thing is that the Cold War didn't end. It went into a freezer period, is now warmed up again. I think that is becoming obvious with the Russian aggression. The paradox is this, that since the end of the supposed victory of the West over a Marxist system in the Soviet Union, the West has itself become more avowedly Marxist in its daily politics. Identitarianism, wokeism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it, is, it seems to me, quite obviously a form of Marxism, at the same time as which China, a supposedly Marxist-Leninist system, has become less and less operatively Marxist. And yet I don't think either side has realized this about the other, or at least it hasn't entered the daily discourse of politics, and it doesn't seem to have been evinced in any editorials or academic journals I see. And I wonder what you both think of this idea.
Yeah, well, the class warfare is definitely not the Marxism that is being upheld right now by Xi Jinping thought. And there is a notion of bringing common prosperity through these poverty alleviation programs in the countryside, but those are explicitly not under the rubric of class warfare. In China, there's a very curious situation right now where Mao Zedong is still on all the bills. Mao Zedong is the great founder of the Chinese Communist Party. But people aren't really comfortable with all the things that Mao Zedong was actually pushing during his lifetime. So if you go full Maoist in contemporary China right now, you're definitely at risk of being persecuted, because there's probably nothing that would drive the current party elite in China make them more nervous, drive them more crazy than actual Maoism. Like, they fear actual Maoism because they've lived through its results. Xi Jinping himself had a father who was persecuted under the Cultural Revolution, of course. But there's still the Leninist party state. It's the hardware of the Soviet Union. It's the party state apparatus that is standing as hardware, but increasingly under Xi Jinping's thought, also as an ideal, as an ideology. So the Leninist party state, which was first a vehicle of bringing communism to society, is now a kind of end goal. Maintaining the Leninist party state under the tight rulership of the central leadership, which in turn revolves around the core Xi Jinping, or maintaining this apparatus is the thing that is the absolute precondition for China rejuvenating. And rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is important for the entire world. So, so Leninist party state building has become an ideology in itself in contemporary China, divorced from the actual, anything that Marx would recognize, really.
Well, my thought is that in a strange sort of way, I mean, and by the way, this is purely analytic. Nothing I say about China or Russia has any sort of moralistic element whatsoever. I'm just purely interested in analysis. And it does intrigue me that the Putin regime, while kind of totally disavowing the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin and so on and so forth, nevertheless is able to call upon the Stalinist moment in the Second World War in very, very emotively effective ways. So they have been able to reclaim this kind of nationalist Stalinism for themselves in the early 21st century. And it seems to me that in a certain sort of way, again, I say this as an observer from afar, the Chinese have been able to call upon the kind of nationalist potential of their state, their state ideology. And echoing what Eric just said, well, actually the question and the answer, the West seems to have adopted, so the Chinese communism is not the communism of class struggle and the abolition of the state and the abolition of the family. This is the cultural revolution that the West has imported. Class struggle, abolition of the family, some sort of.
So you see nations vociferating at the same time as they're actually calling for unity in the West, which I find a rather grimly ironic paradox. Do you think that there is any possibility within the next 10 years of China invading Taiwan without significant U.S. opposition?
Oh, certainly. I think it's all possible. I must say that I get more worried when I read more Xi Jinping thoughts. I've just been just read a book on Xi Jinping thought, and it's almost as if it's on every page. Implicitly, it says we have to take Taiwan. It's a subtext to so much of the discourse.
But I mean, he said it openly at the party conference 3 years ago. They would take Taiwan by 2030.
I mean, the entire intellectual. It's not just a few statements by a few politicians. The largest academic system in the world is the Chinese system. So it's an enormous academic apparatus. And then the Communist Party is the most powerful political organization in the world. And both the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese academia have created an ecosystem in which they have created resources for the legitimization of a future, potential future Taiwan invasion. So everything is lined up to legitimize this war. There's no war yet, but if it starts tomorrow, they can open 10,000 drawers and have their reasons. Everything is at stake. It's harmony. It's the future of humanity. It's the future of different cultures respecting each other, and the future of humankind being able to live in peace. That is at stake. In the struggle, not against Taiwan, but in the Roman spirit that lurks at Taiwan, that uses Taiwan as to get a foothold in the region and expand not just its military might and its political sphere of influence, but also its spirit. So if you have such a binary, if scholars set up such a binary, right, good evil binary. They're creating resources for the legitimization of a possible for war during conflict. So it's very worrisome, and I have no clue how to handle this. Personally, my impression is that we're really in trouble if there's a war that erupts over Taiwan, because first of all, it's going to wreck the world economy. If the Western sanctions on China are going to be absolutely disruptive for both sides. It's going to break the world economy in two halves, basically, and then probably America, even if it wins a few battles. So even if the Taiwanese fight back, and even if the Taiwanese ask the Americans to invade, and even if the Americans are willing to actually help the Taiwanese when push comes to shove, and even if the America militarily wins the first few battles decisively, the Chinese have the largest industrial base and they have a political system with which they can go for 30 years of war. They can easily keep the Chinese population mobilized, at least on a minimal level, for a war effort for 30 years. They can go on for decades. Whereas we know that America doesn't have this stamina when it comes to conflicts far away. So almost certainly the stamina of America will break down. So if conflict emerges, the economy is largely lost. The global world as we know it is largely lost, and the Chinese side is eventually probably going to win the war.
Yeah.
No, only because Eric mentions American sanctions. I read two interesting stories this week, one from Euractiv and one just today from Wall Street Journal. So Euractiv had a very interesting story this week, and they asked the question. They said, who is de-risking from whom? I'm sure we'll all recognize the kind of the EU bureaucratic speak of de-risking. It was a kind of talking point in the last couple of years. This is not sanctions technically. But basically, Euractiv was saying Beijing is de-risking from the EU, not the other way around. That actually the initiative is not coming from the West. The true initiative is coming from Beijing. And in a sense, the argument of this piece was that Europe should be worried. And then the second piece, which I just read today in the Wall Street Journal, there was a 2022 Chinese government directive, I think it's called Document 79, which has to do with the programmatic removal of Western created and Western fabricated technology from China. This kind of gets back to the question of ships I brought up. And this project is known colloquially as Delete A, which means delete America, in fact, which I was quite struck by. And so I think even, I don't disagree with anything that Eric said, but even the kind of 2022 framing of such a conflict in which an internationally illegal invasion takes place, and the kind of West reacts with what they hope will be devastating sanctions. Of course, we all know that the sanctions regime put in place by the West were not devastating, and Russia is seeing quite strong growth, which is, we can hold whatever opinion about that we like, but that is simply the fact reported by the Financial Times in January of this year. So, but I think even that framing is in a sense problematic because the sanctions regime might already be in effect and it might not be Western.
Well, I think there's an overlooked point to the possibility of an American retaliation to China, which is assuming that America does not fight a war of utter attrition. As someone said to me last year at the geopolitics conference here, where do you put all the prisoners? China has the world's largest land army. Who is going to be responsible for feeding and clothing all of those prisoners, assuming that they're not wiped out? And why wouldn't the Chinese retaliate with nuclear force if they saw their army being wiped out? There are too many imponderables in this, I think, to give any serious forecast.
Well, I mean, we did. I just gave you a really bleak. I just had a really bleak outline of the situation. I don't think the threat of nuclear weapons is so large because I mean, I don't think America would be willing to start a nuclear war with China over Taiwan. I don't think America is even willing to fight a long war over Taiwan. I'm not sure if America is willing to fight any war over Taiwan, in fact. And I think China will just win with conventional means, and they can easily win by outproducing the American military-industrial complex and by outlasting American political resolve. I mean, the Americans just got chased out of Afghanistan by the Taliban, right? So, sorry, but America doesn't have the stamina when it comes to wars far away, because there's no real sense in the American population that this is where American interests and freedoms are being defended. Like, I'm sure that if someone would invade Florida or Manhattan, that things would be different. Then suddenly there would be enormous resources of patriotism in American society. But with China, on the Chinese side, you have a Communist Party state which really is good at war. Right, it's really good at maintaining discipline under a population at wartime. That's really what it's. You could argue that even its governance during peacetime is a kind of warlike governance. It's kind of an apparatus that's built for war, that Mao Zedong created during wartime. Very long wars, like against the Republicans, then the Japanese, then the Republicans again. Then the Korea War came in when they were building when they just founded the People's Republic. So it's a machine for war that was used during peacetime. Also like the way that they did the Great Leap Forward, for example, where during the 60s, the early 60s, the late 50s, Mao was basically he was mobilizing the population during peacetime as if it was war. So the Communist parties, Leninist party states are really good at keeping discipline during long wars, and the entire legitimizing ideology for legitimizing this war over Taiwan is already well in place.
Your point about the Chinese people being disillusioned by COVID and by the measures taken there, how would you draw a comparison with the disillusionment of the West of the same measures taken in the same way by supposedly democratic governments?
Well, the Chinese measures were really quite spectacular in the beginning of the COVID pandemic because they actually managed to keep COVID out for 1.5 years. So they sealed off. There was a pandemic.
They let it out and then kept it out.
Yeah, so they kept it out for about it was kept out for about 1.5 years, and they sealed off a country with 1.3 billion people from a global pandemic. And I was really during the COVID pandemic, I was really surprised that it actually was even technically possible.
A global pandemic which originated in their territory, which is even more extraordinary.
And then. But then, of course, the whole time during the COVID, while this was playing out, I was telling my Chinese acquaintances, "Hey, what's the end game? When is China going to open up again?" And I kept hearing this. I kept hearing the stubborn refusal to accept this reality, where my Chinese acquaintances and friends kept telling me, "No, the fight against COVID is forever. We're never going to open up. We're going to keep the virus out forever." And I said, that's not possible. If you have it going around globally, at some point it's going to come back to China. You cannot just keep a wall there for the rest of eternity, right? They said, no, we're going to manage this wall for the rest of eternity. And if Western experts and other foreign experts and virus experts, and also, of course, virus experts in China, which probably weren't willing or capable of speaking out, but knew that China needed an endgame, but it didn't develop an endgame, and it just persuaded the Chinese population it didn't need an endgame. And then when the whole thing came falling down in the end, people who actually had put their faith in the party were greatly disillusioned. And one Chinese friend of mine told me, and this is a very Chinese way of putting it, said, I'm disillusioned by the educational level of the leadership. Because, of course, in the Chinese tradition, there's the notion of the political leadership and educational attainment are very closely linked, right? So the way you see a political leader as legitimate is also by imagining that person to have a very high educational level and a lot of wisdom. And so to say that, I previously believed that Xi Jinping and other leaders, Wang Huning, were very wise leaders. I now see that I'm disappointed in their educational level. So this is truly heartfelt disappointment by people who actually had quite some faith in the party previously.
And I would only add, it's a very kind of obvious and not too sophisticated point, but a similar loss of faith in institutions as a result of the pandemic can be observed in a lot of Western countries as well.
Yes, that's true. That's true. We saw that. We saw that unfolding. Yes.
Right. It's time to ask the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and a microphone will be brought to you. Let's begin here with the gentleman in blue, and then work backwards. Thank you.
Hi, I think I'm supposed to say your name. My name's Robert Greenfield. I think the ship thing has got even deeper meaning. As you know, there was a famous eunuch, Admiral Zheng He, 50 years before Christopher Columbus went. He had the biggest fleet in the world. He came back, said there was nothing out there, and they scuttled it. So they have now the biggest fleet in the world, and I think actually this ship metaphor is more than just about technology. It means that we got the ships, okay, and we're building the ships, whether they're commercial or otherwise. So I think that that's actually a seminal event, real event, not just the philosophical events. I think that's quite important, just for next time when somebody brings that up. The other one, I think the event that you did not mention, which completely altered China, was Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square, I was in China during that time. I started in China in 1981, and I went up to 2019. It changed everything in China. Basically, everybody thought it was going a certain direction. and then that stopped. The education that you're talking about with that 17-year-old, because my wife and I were in international education for many years in China, basically you're talking about the change in how people were taught. And how they are taught is now reflected back in that 17-year-old. So my view is, and my question, because this is not supposed to be a statement, a question is, how do you see this now playing out? The nation or nationalism of China is now so powerful that at times they have to try to hold it back, because when there is anything that happens instantly, they can put a few million people out there in the streets. So to me, the nationalism China is the greatest threat to global security. I just came back from Africa, where everything was all about Wagner Group and the Chinese taking resources. So that it's a great philosophy you're talking about, but to me, the great worry in the world and how China sees the future is I think they see themselves as number one.
Yeah, so, yes, there is a number one sense at least in the official party line, right? So all countries are equal, but maybe China has this very special role to play. At the very least, even in these very sweet new Confucian philosophical accounts, there is the notion that although all the civilizations, political systems, and nations are equal and should respect each other as equal, it's the Chinese wisdom as transmitted through these Qianxia theorists that really will unlock the door to heaven on earth. Now, in the less friendly, more chauvinistic, sinocentric accounts that are more recently put out by legal philosophers such as Zhang Shigong, we're already seeing that now Chinese culture is the principle of harmony that should set the principle of the world at large. So then also China is not just a country. In fact, Zhang Shigong uses the phrase world empire 2.0 because he sees Britain and then America as forming one connected line of world domination, which will be replaced by not a new world domination, but by the force that will end domination, namely a sinocentric world. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of intellectual and political tension here between the notion of all countries being equal and China being a little bit special. Therefore, some people are also arguing, for instance, in this latest book on Xi Jinping thought, which has just been released, that China is furthering multipolarity under a UN framework with, the secret hope that the multipolarity is going to lead to a new unipolarity. How, of course, we still have the Chinese population perhaps being greatly disillusioned at this point and no longer being fully on board with the utopianism. So there's some, if the utopianism in politics becomes too far, removes itself too far from from people's realities, people can become disgruntled. And in fact, of course, Chinese Communist Party utopianism is already a very sober utopianism, right? Because it's a utopianism of realistic GDP forecasts but also a lingering sense of moral improvement. So we'll see where things are heading, but it's definitely important to understand that if a chauvinistic law professor thinks that China is number one, and Xi Jinping theory thought implicitly implies that China is number one, that some Chinese people in Chinese society and the people you've worked with for years while working in Chinese education may not feel in their hearts that China is number one if they feel their mobility is restricted, if they feel their world is closing off, if they see that the party leadership made big claims during COVID and then didn't execute and show themselves to be a power party, a party that's very good at maintaining power, but not necessarily the party that always has the long-term future plan for the country in policy sense.
No, I was just going to add that, I had an interesting conversation about 12 years ago with a couple of Nigerians, and I just asked them who they would rather do business with, Americans or Chinese. Both of whom are very present in the continent. And they said without a moment's hesitation, they would rather do business with the Chinese. And that really kind of increased my interest and what whetted my appetite to observe kind of the presence of China in South America and Africa. But I do think, kind of practically speaking, that the kind of fanaticism for certain cultural causes célèbres. I mean, Eric is, I think, absolutely convincingly and properly asked questions about the rhetoric of kind of endless respect for other cultures coming out of Beijing and so on and so forth. But there is actually, I guess I would only say there is a certain absence of a kind of frenetic desire to see cultural change in Africa and Latin America, which you do see coming from the West, and it's very obnoxious.
Just to interject, I need to I agree with you, and I need to add it as a nuancing point. I mean, so for instance, also this notion that China has never fought aggressive warfare is of course a propaganda line, but there is something to the notion that the Chinese imperial tradition wasn't very warlike. So if you go to these Egyptian temple ruins, you'll see images of the enemies of the pharaoh being castrated. This was very warlike images. This was not the mainstream Chinese imperial tradition, where the notion was the leadership is calm, reflected, well educated, writes poetry in a garden. And so there's some sense, for instance, when the Mongolians took over China and founded the Yuan dynasty, the first thing they started planning was, okay, now that we have this territory that we today call China, let's start planning the invasion of Taiwan, right? Whereas China had been sitting there the whole time, not planning the invasion of planning the invasion of Japan. And China, that's the first thing the Mongols wanted to do, go on and invade Japan. And China had been there the whole time, not apparently planning to invade Japan. So there is some sense of the harmony narrative isn't though it's abused propagandistically, and it can hide intentions that are less pure, let's say, it's not complete bogus. It's a real meaningful ideal in the Chinese tradition of political thought. And even nowadays, with the Chinese Communist Party in power, there is a sense that some of it may be a little bit real.
Next question, please. The gentleman here in the third row.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for these inspiring talks. I would also like to further pursue this issue of the harmony narrative. I would start by saying that it's easy to be harmonious until you are alone. You are only confronted with your own. But it seems that whenever China is confronted with something culturally different, be it the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the same system of domination comes in as in what it criticizes with other nations. How do they see those episodes? Are they antagonisms that will somehow, I don't know, dissolve in time in their favor, or what's the narrative about them?
Well, so for instance, Xu Jiling, he's a scholar. I think in Shanghai. He's in mainland China, and he is considered more of a liberal. In 2015, he published the article. It's translated into English as the New Chensha, and he argues, well, China should bring the world spirit to the world, but it's not currently living up to that world spirit. It's particularly not in the way it treats ethnic minorities within China, and not in the way it treats its neighboring countries. So China is falling short of its world historical mission. So that is a way of turning these narratives of harmony into a platform for criticizing the Chinese Communist Party. It's, however, of course, in recent years, figures such as Xu Jiling have been a little bit quieter. In fact, I haven't seen any recent essays by him on this subject. So there's definitely a lot going on. It's just that under the surface, so to speak, it's just that at this moment, Xi Jinping thought has become so dominant, and it's so it's pushed through all the systems in such a hard and rigorous manner that there's very little way of using these intellectual resources and discourses and genuine ideals and push them in a different direction. So that's why I spoke of the narrowing of the intellectual field. There is an intellectual field there where you have critical traditions. In fact, the concept of harmony itself could be employed critically, but under the current political circumstances, it's very hard to have that in publicized public discourse in China.
And one final question, please, if we may, if there is one. Gentleman at the back in the flannel shirt.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, David, for such a wonderful and fascinating discussion. My question, primarily directed to Eric, is that the movers and shapers of China's futures, rather than Politburo officials in jet black dyed hair, would be the young people of China, the 18 to 30-year-old crowd. Do you have any insights as to how they view China's future? Thank you.
Well, I don't, but thank you for your question. It's an important question. It's hard to get data on reliable, large-scale data are hard to come by everywhere, but especially in China, and especially on topics that could be politically sensitive, which are exactly the kind of topics that we would be interested in. So I don't have a lot of faith in data on this, but I would have faith in quality ethnographic accounts, people doing studies involving young Chinese people, and to see where they stand. Now, I have read a few education ethnographies involving Chinese students preparing for education in the United States, and there is a sense that the young Chinese people are particularly prone to be in line with the nationalistic discourses. I mean, the notion that we sometimes naively have is the young people rebel against the authoritarian structures in society, and the old people, they carry the authoritarian structures in society. But in China, it's more that the old people, they have lived through all kinds of things in Chinese history. They know that the party tells something now, and they used to tell something different in the past, right? So that already gives you a source of a potential source of critical reflection. Whereas the young people, they just come out of this education system where they very much learned the party line. So the young people, it's not very rare. They don't necessarily, probably have the least resources to oppose the party line. So they're probably the most indoctrinated, quote unquote. So it's a little bit under the Leninist party state that's so well established as the Chinese Leninist party state, with all of its power over the mediascape and the flow of information in society. It's really hard to be optimistic about young people, but I am very interested in decent qualitative research into the matter.
And it's purely anecdotal, but I mean, I've had conversations with very, very cosmopolitan and sophisticated. Actually, in the case I'm thinking of, the person I'm thinking of is an artist, a painter, and we discussed the Cultural Revolution briefly, and she was very quick to defend the kind of logic and necessity of the Cultural Revolution against external critique. And so there seems to be a greater, purely anecdotal, but a greater faith in sort of the recent history and logic of the nation than I would anecdotally report among my cohort in the West.
Well, I suppose leave the last word to Ignatius Loyola. Give me the boy at 7 and I'll show you the man. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Hendriks, for taking what is a nebulous and extremely difficult to grasp history and philosophy and making it so clear and lucid for us. And you, Dr. Dusenbury, for such perspicacious comments. And you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here tonight and being our audience for this marvellous talk. Thank you.